Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to go through Unit 2 of AP Human Geography on population and migration. So we're going to look at why populations grow and why populations decline. And we're going to look at how that affects countries. We're going to look at the causes and effects of population change, specifically migration as well, because immigration and emigration, two different terms, impact society, population levels, economic processes, culture, a whole heck of a lot. So yeah, let's dive into it. So I have some resources available for you to use. Of course, I have the guided notes for the lectures. I have the practice tests, the multiple choice and free response for the unit, as well as some practice quizzes on population pyramids, as well as the transition models. So if you need practice with those specific concepts, those are ones that can get a little confusing for students because you're having to read charts and understand different stages of a model. So these are good practice on those specific topics. As always, my lectures cover the course through the course and exam description. This is a document created by the College Board that outlines the entire AP Human course from start to finish. It separates it into units and topics, and I'm going to follow this unit and topic outline. It tells you what you need to know, as well as how you need to know it. It tells you how you're going to be asked it on the exam. It's very, very helpful, and the link is in the description down below. I highly suggest that you learn it. All right, so here we go. Population distribution. It's very simple. It's where people are. Where are they distributed throughout the world? We can see here we have some population clusters throughout the world, like in East Asia and China, and South Asia in India specifically. We also have population cluster in Europe. We have some in Eastern United States, as well as Central Sub-Saharan Africa. So yeah, a trend that I see here is that populations like in South America, Africa, even in Asia, in the United States, is that they're clustered closer to the coastlines. They're more dispersed, more separated the further inland you go, as well as the more north and the more south you get. Look at South Africa. It's a lot more dispersed than Central Africa, where the equator is. Antarctica, Greenland, Iceland, they have very few people living there. They're not exactly zero, but the numbers are a lot less, so we don't really see any dots for that matter. Any clusters. The further north you get into Canada, the less people are. That's just, it gets colder. There's a lot of factors that impact population. So we have physical factors like climate, or temperature, the weather. People may not want to live somewhere where there's a lot of earthquakes, so they may not live in Japan or California. Landforms can separate populations. Oceans can separate where people are. Obviously, there's not a lot of people living in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, but we could have plateaus and mountains separate populations. We have the Himalayas is a good one. Look at north of the Himalayan region. There's not a lot of people there, but south of the Himalayas, there's a lot of population there. Deserts, not a lot of people live in the deserts. Look at Egypt and northern Africa. There's not a lot of people living in that big Sahara desert, but closer to the coastline where there's water, it's a little more tolerable, so there's going to be population clusters there. Populations tend to settle near water bodies, whether that be an ocean or a pond or a river. That's a very good one, like the Nile River or the Mississippi River. They tend to do this because water is good for hydration. You need water to live. It's good for transportation, so you can travel to different places and you can interact with them. You can trade with them and boost the economy. But you can also grow crops. You can develop irrigation systems, or you can just use the water in general to grow food, because food is very important to survive. And civilizations in the first cities actually developed because we had a food surplus. It wasn't until we had a surplus of food that we could store, and that led to the first cities to be developed. Now, besides these physical factors, we also have human factors. We ourselves impact where we are located. So culture is a big one. Typically, people like to live within similar cultures. In areas where there's a lot of diverse cultures, that can create a lot of tension through the differences that can spring up. So we see a lot of similar cultures in population clusters. I'm thinking of Utah right now. Utah has a lot of Mormons. So a Mormon that doesn't live in Utah may see it as an attractive place to move to because there's a lot of other Mormons there. We also see that with Chinatowns in the United States. There's a lot of foreign Chinese residents or Chinese Americans living in Chinatowns in like Boston, New York, San Francisco because of the culture similarities as well as the language. Because a lot of especially foreigners who come from China or the East Asia area or residents who have parents that speak Mandarin or other dialects of other Chinese dialects, they may like to live somewhere where they can utilize that language and maybe their native language, the first language they spoke, so they're most fluent in that language. So common cultural similarities, even common history is a very big impact on human population. Economics is also a big thing. People like to live where there's a lot of job opportunities, where maybe the standard of living is a little higher. In urban areas, there's typically a lot more job opportunities in a very rural area. Rural areas typically have more agriculture. Urban areas start out with manufacturing and factories, and then as the country develops, we've seen that they move towards service-based jobs like retail and office work. Politics is also pretty important. People like to live, of course, in areas where there's similar politics. We see that urban areas are a little more liberal and rural areas are a little more conservative, and that does impact where people live. Conservatives may not want to live in urban areas. As a result, they may find that the local government situation is just not up to what they want to live in. And the same applies to liberals who may not want to live in rural areas because they may disagree with the politics, and they like to live somewhere where a local government or even a state is more influenced by the beliefs that they believe in. So all of this impacts the distribution of population. And of course, population distribution has its own effects on the world, which we'll get into later. So let's look at some specific examples here. So deserts, areas like the Sahara Desert, which is in kind of northern Africa area, it's dry, it's a lot of sand. There's not a lot of people there because it's very harsh living conditions, and there's a lack of water. You can't grow crops in sand. It's sand. You can't grow food there, and you can't grow food without water. And if you can't grow food, people can't survive, and there's just no population then. Regions with what's considered temperate climates, like in Western Europe, Northwestern United States, Southeastern Australia, South Asia, where all of these main population clusters are located near the equator. That's where the climate is the most temperate. It's where it's more tropical, best suited for growing agriculture, especially crops that you can generate a surplus. There's also comfortable living conditions. You can have your 4 seasons. It may not get too hot. It may not get too cold either. So yeah, urban living is most prominent in these temperate climate zones. And of course, we've said that people like to live near water, specifically the coast. There's higher population densities because you can trade with other places, you can go to them, and you can fish. And if you have access to fresh water, you can grow crops. Fish is very important. Fishing isn't something new. We've been fishing for hundreds and thousands of years. It's been a very sustainable way for us to feed ourselves. These transitions are very slow, and I don't know why. Some more specific, let's go to the North China Plain. It has a big population, that north, like orange area on the map. Not so north that you're reaching kind of the Russia area, but that orange part of the map. It has a dense population here because it has good soil. It has flat terrain, which is perfect for agriculture. You don't want a lot of hilly agriculture. That can make it a lot harder. And then when it rains, crops can just run off down the hill. And it also makes for better urban development. It's a lot easier to build cities and towns and houses on flat land, not mountainous land, not swampy land. North China Plain has millions of wells, which is very productive for agriculture. The North China Plain is one of China's most important agriculture regions. They produce wheat, maize, peanuts, sesame seeds, cotton, a lot of vegetables as well. It's very, very efficient in agriculture production. And then look over here at the Nile River Valley, which is in Egypt. We can see that in Egypt, population population is clustered near the Nile River Delta region in the north, and then along the Nile River, because the river provides water for drinking, agriculture, as well as transportation. You can get to North Egypt from the very bottom of the river just by traveling up the river, which is very easy to do for the Nile River. So yeah. We could look at the rest of Egypt, though. Where are the people? There's just nobody there because it's desert. There's sand. It's not good. It's hot. It's just madness, I tell you. So look here at another map of China. We can see that the 10 most populated cities and areas in China here are on rivers. They're on water. Rivers are fresh water. You can grow crops. You can transport from place to place. And look here how they're all on the east. China's population is clustered on the east. It's not really clustered on the west. There are people living in the west. There's a lot of minority groups living in the west. But the population is a lot more dispersed in the west. Western China has very hot summers, and then since it's kind of a desert, there's very cold and long winters. And there's also cold winds that sweep down from the north as well. So you can kind of see the southeastern region is the most popular. Northeastern is a little more dispersed. The east is also flatter. It's more wet. It's easier to farm. So you can produce enough food for a large population, a growing population. And of course, there's a lot more economic activity and infrastructure available in the east. And with that economic activity in the east, there's a lot more poverty in the west. The 10 major rivers in China abroad developed from the Tibet Plateau, which you can see right here. And this provides living and water production for a third of East Asia. So this plateau has runoff water that fuels into these rivers here, and that gives a third of the population's water. It provides water for a third of the world's population in East Asia and South Asia. So the plateau itself is, I think, 25 kilometers long, but it's not really nice to live in. You can kind of see it's in that 6% here because it's cold, it's windy. It also reaches high altitudes, which isn't easy for farming. It isn't easy to live in because the oxygen levels are lower, and that's also oxygen levels are needed for plants and agriculture. So when there's less oxygen, it's harder to grow crops. And look here at the Gobi Desert, we see just, again, not a very clustered population. 94% of China's population lives in the east for all the reasons I just specified. So there's a lot of factors that kind of work together to impact the population in China. And I don't need to know this for every single country. I'm not just leaving you one out of 195. But I'm just trying to kind of show you how this all works together to influence the population in China. Let's look at Canada a little bit. This one's a little more self-explanatory because the further north you get, the more cold it gets, and people don't like to live somewhere where icicles form on their eyelashes. More than 90% of Canadians live within 150 miles of the U.S. border, and we can definitely see that here on the map. There's actually a line, the green line, shows you 100 kilometers from the border, and most of that population lives around that line, within 150 kilometers. We can see a lot of population on coast. We can see that's where the cities are developed. There are some little towns and developments the further north you get, like Yellowknife, but that's near a body of water. I don't know if you can see it. I certainly can. Ikuliat, I don't know how to say that at all, but that's also near a body of water. So yeah, there's a lot of terrain and geography in certain parts of Canada that also make it very hard to farm and to just live. This is called the Canadian Shield, and you can kind of see here that in this shield area, there's not a lot of population, and this is why. Look at that. There's a lot of trees. It's very rocky. If there is soil, the soil is very, very dense. A lot of it's also too acidic, and when there's no soil, there's rock, and you can't grow crops on rock. It's very hard to develop on rock. There's just a lot of granite, and people don't take it for granite. That was supposed to be funny. Anyways, it's just not very suitable for populations to cluster and develop. Even with the climate, there's long, harsh winters, and the summers are short. They're pretty mild. The climate has slowed the development of new soil. They can also create permafrost, which creates problems for construction. So even if there are spots where it's flat, the permafrost will melt during the summer, and it just makes it impossible to build infrastructure. There's very limited flat land for housing and transportation infrastructure. At Russia here, most of Russia's population lives in the west of the Ural Mountains. The climate's more temperate. In the west, there's more connections to East Asia. You can trade and boost the economy, and that helps particularly in the west. That's where the capital is, Moscow. You can kind of see here, there's a lot of developments around Moscow as well. People want to live closer to the capital today, so new cities and infrastructure aren't really going to develop in the east or even in central Russia. They're going to develop more towards the west, closer to that capital. People want to live closer to where the action is. Eastern Russia, of course, has very harsh winters. It has lots of frozen tundra, so a lot of snow. The Far East is the coldest region in Russia, and an average daily maximum temperature is -1 degrees, which is very, very cold. So you can see why the population is a lot more dispersed in the east than in the west. So the World Population Center is just kind of providing a general overview for you. East Asia is where a fourth of the world population is. South Asia has a good chunk of the world population too. Over 1 billion people live in India, and they're kind of isolated through the Himalayas on one side and then a desert in Pakistan on the other side. So it kind of creates a population pocket in South Asia. East Asia kind of has that too. There's deserts and an ocean surrounding East Asia. In Europe, we see a lot of populations concentrated in big cities like London and Paris and Madrid. And we also see a population cluster in sub-Saharan Africa. This is kind of newer. The population growth rate in sub-Saharan Africa is very, very high compared to areas in Europe or North America. In North America, we see a big metropolitan area in northeastern United States, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington. It kind of has developed to a point where if you leave one city, you're coming up right onto another city. So it's a big metropolitan area and it creates a big population cluster. We do see other major cities in the United States because the United States is huge, okay? The state of Michigan alone is bigger than the United Kingdom. So we see other cities like Los Angeles, Seattle, Orlando, Atlanta, a lot of cities in Texas like Austin, Dallas. They're obviously big cities, but they're all kind of separated from one another. This is a big population cluster, particularly because it's part of one of the oldest parts of the United States, where the United States was first developed in the Revolution, after the Revolution, for the colonies. Yeah, there we go. So let's look at some more human factors influencing population. A lot of this is going to seem like common sense, but if I asked you this before the lecture, you may have struggled to answer it. So people like to live where it's safe, where crime rates are low. They want to live where there's job opportunities, and they also want to live with similar people, whether that be close to family or friends, similar cultures, similar religions, stuff like that. There's a city in India. It's known as the City of Temples. It has a very dense population. The picture here, the photograph, is taken in that city. It's a major religious center for Hindus. It has a collection of thousands of historic and newly built Hindu temples. It's a major hub for pilgrims all over India who come to perform rituals, prayers, purifications at the city's stone steps. They lead down to a major river in India. That river is full of trash now. Paris, France is also a city with a large population because it has a historic, cultural, and artistic significance. Notre Dame Cathedral is coming to my mind. There's also the Eiffel Tower. Many people go to Luxembourg Gardens too. You can see here in the center of Paris, that's what this map shows. That's where the urban development is most prominent, and that's where the population is most prominent. And in European cities, that central part of the city is the historic districts. That's where all the tourist attractions are going to be. That's where the main economic hubs of Paris are going to be as well. So people are going to want to live there. All right, let's look at Chinatown. I kind of briefly touched on Chinatowns earlier, but let's look at San Francisco's in particular. So San Francisco's Chinatown is very vibrant. There's a high Chinese American population. San Francisco's Chinatown is the largest Chinatown outside of Asia, and it's the most densely populated urban area west of Manhattan. I think in 2013, 75% of Chinatown residents were foreign-born. It's a hub for small businesses, but also large businesses, a lot of local businesses that contribute to the local Chinatown and San Francisco economy and provide, of course, employment opportunities for residents. So yeah, Chinese history is also found here, since Chinatown historically served as a refugee center for people to escape the hostilities in China and possibly score in the California gold rush in the mid-19th century. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. The neighborhood also has some cultural attractions, of course, Chinese culture, and culinary offerings, restaurants that attract tourists, and of course, Chinese immigrants, foreigners, that sort of thing. They come from all around the world, and this creates economic growth and supports the sustainability of local businesses. Everything is kind of clustered together if you look at this picture. Yeah, there's cars, but it's also very easy to get around, very walkable. So much is close together. That's city living. More than 80% of households in Chinatown don't own a car, and the neighborhood has a compact grid and alleyway network, which I wish I could have showed you, but it makes it very pedestrian friendly. It's essentially, think of a grid. That's Chinatown. There's also annual celebrations such as the Chinese New Year Parade, the Moon Festival, the Lantern Festival, and these bring residents together to celebrate cultural traditions, which is very cool. Similar culture impacts population. So you can kind of see here on the maps, here on the right map, that little red square, that's Chinatown and San Francisco. And then if you look on the left map, you can kind of pinpoint where Chinatown is. It's labeled, actually, if you can read it, I'll try to circle it with the very cool pen that PowerPoint has available to me. There, that's Chinatown. We can see here that it's a major population cluster in San Francisco. So there's a lot of people living there because there's a lot of economic opportunities. There's a lot of cultural similarities. There's a lot of historic significance to it. Let's look at London. London is very, very important to the world. It's a financial hub. There's a lot of foreign exchange going on. There's capital markets, global banks, and distribution with global influence on the economy. As we look at the establishment of the Bank of England, that's a major bank now. We also saw the London Stock Exchange develop, which originally started in a coffee house, and this laid the foundation for London's financial services. They also have a very extensive transportation network. London's pretty big, so you can get to and from somewhere within the city within a day. Traffic's pretty bad there, but you can also get to the city. You can get around the city, wherever you want to go, because there's a lot of transportation options. Like, look at the picture. You have a really cool red bus you could go on. There's also the London Underground, there's railways, and so that makes for very easy commuting and accessibility across the city, to and from the city, wherever you want to go. And this promotes population movement, cultural exchange, economic development, that sort of thing. We also see a lot of diverse housing options. It's a big city, so it can support people for a variety of income levels. Or maybe people want to live in more historic areas. They can live in the historic district. Or maybe they want to live somewhere that's more modern, more hip. Then they can do that. London will accommodate a range of lifestyles and income levels. Okay, there we go. I don't know why it's so slow today. So Athens is where the University of Georgia, UGA, is located. It's a small town in Georgia. There's a very large large young adult population here. Not majority of the population, but a good chunk of the population is just UGA students. And that's very helpful because there's housing available. It's not like a big city where there could be a housing shortage. There's housing on campus as well as off campus for students, directed to students. 40% of Athens is either a student or a faculty member of the college. There's a lot of job opportunities, like for being a professor at the school or the janitor, if that's what suits you, as well as opportunities for businesses for students. This picture is of a Latin American restaurant called Tito's, I think is what it's called. It's apparently a very prominent restaurant in Athens. For the students. It's also a very bikeable and walkable area. Yes, you can bring your car if you have one, but if you don't have a car, that's okay. Maybe you don't want to pay the expenses of a car for repairs, for gas, for insurance, or oil changes, that sort of thing. Cars are very expensive. So if you don't have one, that's fine. You can get around the city. You can get on and off campus. There's also historic districts. There's also areas that are going through redevelopment projects, more modern, more hip areas that can increase population density. They're doing this particularly by replacing old buildings, and they're putting in residential buildings like houses and apartments, as well as mixed-use developments. And essentially, mixed-use development is you're putting in one little area, you're putting housing, you're putting business, you're putting recreation, you're kind of putting a little pocket of everything. And that's attractive for populations and for people moving there. So yeah, the historic districts though, the top picture on the left here is of the historic district. There's a lot of character-rich areas, areas for historic preservation. It creates a sense of community as well, a sense of charm in Athens, makes it a unique place. Now let's talk about population density. Now you probably know what population density is. It's the amount of people per square unit of land. But there's 3 different types of population density. Now you don't have to do any math on the AP exam, so don't have a cow, but you do need to know what these different population density measurements are. So the first one's arithmetic density, and this is the number of people living in a certain area. This is what you think of when you think of population density. Okay, so the United States, it's 34 people per square kilometer. In Egypt, it's 109 people per square kilometer. In Germany, it's 236 people per square kilometer. So what does this tell you? Well, arithmetic density can show where urbanization is happening. We can see here that the United States, while there's a lot of major cities, especially that metropolitan center we were talking about earlier, there's a lot of rural development. I mean, think of central and midwestern United States. There's just so much rural development where the population is so spread out. So this is going to lower the overall arithmetic density. But Germany has a lot more cities, cities closer together, I should say, as well. A lot more clustered population. So the population per people per square mile is going to be a lot higher. Look at Egypt. Remember how I said Egypt? Nobody's living in most of Egypt because there's sand, and sand is not where crops grow. Yeah, they're all living along the Nile River or the Nile River Delta or along the Mediterranean. But so many people are living there that it's going to increase their arithmetic density. So we can see here, these are maps of the world urbanization, so we can see where our cities are located. And we can also look at population density. And if you see a pattern here, the population density is higher in areas where there's urbanization, where there's a lot of cities, which is very interesting. I like the one of Nigeria. If you don't know where Nigeria is, I will circle it on both maps here. So this is Nigeria. This is Nigeria. So we can see here there's a lot of urban developments being sprung up in Nigeria. The growth rate's really high. It's above 5%, which is a high growth rate. You can look on this map. There's a big density in Nigeria. The population is booming there. So yeah, very interesting. They have a high arithmetic density. So physiological density. What is physiological density? This is the number of people, but per square unit of farmable land. Arithmetic density is all the land in the country. Physiological density is farmable land in the country. So a higher physiological density suggests that there's agricultural land being used and they may reach their output limit sooner. Okay? So the agricultural land is being used by more people. So more people are on a farm. Farms may be getting smaller, or there's areas where you could farm, but people are just living there. They're building a road. The government is using eminent domain to build a road. They could be doing that. And because there's a lot of people per unit of farmable land, you're going to have to probably produce more food, and you may reach your output limit sooner than a country that has a lower physiological density. Egypt is a great example of this because they have a physiological density that's getting high, and it's closer to Bangladesh. Despite Egypt being, for the most part, desert, 3% of Egypt's land is farmable, 62% of Bangladesh's land is farmable. Arable's the other term. I like saying farmable because it sounds better, but 62% and 3%. But they have similar physiological densities. That's because there's just so much people in Egypt compared to Bangladesh over the arable land, because there's a lot less arable land in Egypt, so their physiological densities are going to be similar. So why would someone use physiological density? You've probably never heard of it. So you're like, why is this never important? If I've never heard of it, it must just be stupid. Well, a high physiological density indicates that a large number of people depend on a relatively small area of arable land. This is a great response for an FRQ. If College Board asks you something about physiological density on an FRQ, this may be a good response somewhere. So we could ask questions like, are the methods for agriculture, for farming, sustainable in the long term for feeding the country now and in the future, and as well as supporting the environment? A high physiological density may indicate environmental strain because you're going to have to feed a lot of people.
It can also help identify areas where infrastructure improvements are needed, like in irrigation systems or transportation networks may be needed to support agriculture productivity. If you're living in an area with a high physiological density, like Egypt, yeah, 3% of the country is farmable, but that 3% can be very important. So you want to maximize the crops grown. So you may put in extensive irrigation systems to try to grow as much crops as possible and to limit any loss of product as well. High physiological density might indicate a need for economic diversification to reduce any dependency that you have on agriculture. What about agricultural density? This is the last one. So this is similar to physiological density because you're looking at arable land, but you're looking at the number of farmers. The number of farmers per unit of arable land. So the map kind of shows you where that is. And if you look closely, you can kind of see that areas that have a higher physiological density have a bit of a higher agriculture density. There's a lot of farmers and not a lot of land. That's high agriculture density. If you it's high in areas with small scale farmers where farming is the dominating livelihood. It's higher in rural areas as well. And these are areas that have fertile land, flat terrain, adequate water supply. So areas where farming is like very prominent in the economy, where they're farming to feed themselves, feed their villages, feed their communities. Those are areas that have a high agriculture density. And these are areas that typically are more or less developed. Where there's not a lot of farmers, but a lot of land, that's where you see a lower agriculture density. Areas that are more urban, countries that are more developed, or economies that have more business-related agriculture, agribusiness, more commercial agriculture, those are going to be areas with low agriculture density. Commercial agriculture has a lot more technology, a lot more pesticides and other chemicals involved, so you don't need as much labor as you did before. You need a lot less farmers. So the agriculture density is going to decrease over time. This can be seen in areas that have maybe bad conditions for farming, like a harsh climate or poor soil quality. Soil quality declines over time the more you use it, which is something to note as well. This could also just be because of urban development that takes away farmland because you got to build apartments. This can also indicate agriculture productivity. So areas with higher agriculture density typically have higher agriculture productivity. It can indicate land use efficiency. So are you using all the arable land to farm? It can indicate food production levels as well. So yeah.
Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. It really does help me out, and it costs $0. I have some free resources for you in the description down below if you'd like to use them. If you have any AP Human Geography related questions whatsoever, don't hesitate to leave a comment down below the video or send me a message on Discord. I'll see you guys in the next video, though. Adios.